Man pleads guilty to hate crime attack at the University of Waterloo. Spike in people fleeing Canada for the United States. Canada has barely completed any of the 231 calls for action from the report into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Founder of Greece's far-right party sent back to jail, and Nigerian unions have shut down that country's electricity grid over the minimum wage. Good morning. It's Tuesday, June 4th. I'm Nora. Here are your headlines. This morning, let's start in Waterloo, Ontario, where a man has pled guilty to stabbing an instructor and two students in a gender studies class at the University of Waterloo. Giovanni Alalba Aleman stabbed two students in Hagee Hall. Asha Shetty from CBC News reminds us that the attack was considered a hate crime that targeted gender expression and gender identity. He had also been charged with attempted murder and terror charges, though in his guilty plea, there were no mentions of the hate crimes. The 24-year-old was not in the class. He entered the class, spoke to the associate professor before attacking her. And side note, Shetty interchanges the terms instructor and associate professor to refer to the older of the three victims, so I'm not sure which one is accurate, though associate professor is used twice, whereas instructor is used once. There is no more information about why Vilalba Aleman did it, what he was influenced by, or anything more about why he undertook his attack. Next, there was a 70% increase of people moving from Canada to the United States in 2022 over 2021. That equals 126,000 total people. The number is split pretty evenly among three kinds of people. 53,000 people were Canadians, 46,000 were Americans, and 30,000 had immigrated to Canada from a country other than the United States. CTV's Dorcas Marfo speaks with Len Saunders, an immigration lawyer who said he thinks that the biggest cause is the cost of living in Canada. Like, for example, you can actually buy a house in the United States. He said that many people are moving to towns just south of the border, as he notes that a 45-minute commute from Washington is worth the $2 to $3 million saved in buying a home in Vancouver. There have been a slew of similar stories in other media outlets this past week, whether that's about people moving to Nicaragua or to Colombia for similar reasons. And I have to say that moving out of Ontario was honestly the best thing I ever did. It wasn't exactly a choice when you move for a job, but it's been so much cheaper than had we stayed in Toronto. Of course, the forces of decay are coming for Quebec too, but at least we've been sheltered from it for a bit. Next, it's been 5 years since the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls released their final report. And not too surprisingly, barely any of the recommendations have been acted on. The final report contained 231 calls for justice. Both Michelle Odette and Marion Buller, who were commissioners for the inquiry, said that they're frustrated by the lack of action. Odette has since been appointed to the Senate and has used her role to push for the calls of action to be heeded. CBC News' Olivia Stefanovich is reporting that Cindy Woodhouse is also frustrated by the lack of action. The AFN national chief said that this inaction is, quote, a historic low point, unquote. Odette in particular mentioned the possibility of a Poilievre government being a disaster for the implementation of these calls. Odette, who had once run for the Liberals, says that she hasn't seen anything from the Conservatives about what they will do when they're elected. It's estimated that the calls will cost billions of dollars to implement, and the Liberals have committed to spending $2 billion, which isn't enough for long-term sustainable funding. The article also doesn't mention how much money is being cut from Indigenous Services Canada or Crown Indigenous Relations, which is part of the government's current austerity plan. Also, the commitment of $2 billion is meaningless if the Liberals haven't actually addressed the calls to action yet. Next to international news, and first to Greece, where the founder of Golden Dawn, that country's far-right party, has been sent back to prison. Al Jazeera reports that Nikos Mikaloliakos was sentenced to 13.5 years for heading a criminal organization that attacked and even killed political opponents and immigrants and refugees. Golden Dawn activists murdered an anti-fascist rapper and beat Egyptian fishermen and communist trade unionists. Mikaloliakos had won an early parole from a judge, but the decision was appealed and the court decided that he was unrepentant and shouldn't have had his sentence shortened. Mikaloliakos has written articles from prison that praised the, quote, Nazi-style practices of Golden Dawn and was suspected of committing new crimes, unquote. Golden Dawn became the third most popular party in Greece in the wake of the debt crisis that happened several years ago. And finally, the Nigerian Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress are on strike, and this strike has shut down Nigeria's electrical grid and interrupted flights. Trade unionists chased out workers in power control rooms and shut down at least 6 substations before the entire electrical grid came to a halt. The unions are on an unlimited general strike to pressure the government to raise the minimum wage. It's their 4th strike since Bola Tinubu became president last year. The electricity and aviation unions have told their members to withhold their services and respect the strike. Currently, Nigeria's minimum wage is just 30,000 naira. That equals $20 per month. The unions want it to rise to the equivalent of $336 per month, but the government's counteroffer was just $40 per month. Under Tinubu, the cost of living in Nigeria has soared. The unions promise that they will not end the strike until the government meets their demands. And that, folks, is how it's done. Those are your headlines for Tuesday, June 4th. I'm Nora. It's Tuesday. It's Sandy and Nora Day. Expect a new episode to drop in a couple of hours. If my plan goes to plan. How do you normally say that to not land on saying plan twice? Anyway, I am in the air actually as you listen to this. And so if everything goes to plan, I will have an episode drop around the right time. If 11, 12, 1 o'clock Eastern time rolls around and there's no new Sandy and Nora, well, that's because I screwed something up. And you'll have to wait until I land in Edmonton, at which point, you know what? I'll be on time for noon in the Mountain Time Zone. So look out for it. We talk about AI. It's a really great conversation. You are listening to this podcast at sandynora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.